Welcome to FAQs Live. My name's Duncan. I'm Head of Learning and Development here at Agility in Mind. And today's topic, we're going to be talking about the requirements model in SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. Just a quick note, I'm sure Zoom's already told you, but this session is being recorded. And so bear that in mind. Let me talk first of all a little bit about the logistics for the day and how we're going to run the webinar. So the topic is requirements in SAFe. I've prepared for you a bit of a presentation on the different sort of elements of requirements in SAFe. Good. So this is what we're going to be looking at today, the requirements model in SAFe, the Scaled Agile Framework. And there's lots of terminology in Agile detailing requirements and sort of different ways of expressing requirements. SAFe has chosen quite a bit of the language from Agile and made it very specific. So, for example, the word epic means all sorts of different things to different people in Agile in general. And the same with the word feature, or maybe even enabler or story. You know, these things mean a whole range of different things to different people. In the Scaled Agile Framework, they're very specific and they have a very significant meaning. So one of the things hopefully to take away from this session is that if you're working in a Scaled Agile environment, when people start talking about epics or features or stories or enablers, you'll have a common language. And SAFe is not right or wrong in the way that they choose to sort of describe epics or features, but if you're in that sort of domain, one of the benefits of a standardized framework is that people know what they're talking about. So that's hopefully what we'll sort of get into the basics today. So this is how we're going to run today's session. We'll first talk about business requirements at all levels within the framework. So business requirements really are, I guess, the sort of more tangible user-facing things that you actually get. And that can be at an individual team level all the way through to a program level. Then we'll talk about enabler requirements, and that's SAFe's way of describing technical requirements, things that don't necessarily change the behavior of the software or the products, but which are worth investing in to allow you to continue to produce business requirements in the future. And then finally, we'll look at epic requirements, which have a bit of a special status in SAFe. They're portfolio level requirements, significant capital investments, and they're handled a little bit differently. So we'll treat those in that way. Good. So the first topic then is on business requirements. And business requirements at the team level are expressed in a very familiar format, the user story. User stories were created long before SAFe came along. The problem that they were trying to solve is a lightweight format to express the nub of a requirement. They're often referred to as a placeholder for a conversation later. Nice clear title. As a particular role, I want some functionality so that I get some value or benefit. So here's one example, a very simple example, a very understandable example. Login or user login. As an existing customer, I want to be able to securely log into my account so that I can access my stuff, but no one else can. So that's the sort of thing, depending on the system and depending on the complexity of login. I mean, login could be an epic in some cases, but the idea of a user story, a business user story, is it's at the level where an individual team can have it in their team backlog, and they can produce several of these items within a single iteration. An iteration is typically 2 weeks. So to give you an idea of the rough order of magnitude, the rough scale of a story in SAFe, it will be fairly typical for one individual team to complete maybe somewhere between 5 to 10 stories within a single iteration. That's roughly the size, the sort of scale of a story. So stories live in team backlogs. Team backlogs, again, mean very specific things in SAFe. That's referring, well, maybe it's not rocket science. It's the backlog, the list of requirements given to an individual team, which they would have planned in, probably sort of via sort of PI planning, which is a topic of another webinar. So for one team, the team backlog contains business stories, business user stories, and it's managed by the product owner. In SAFe, the product owner is the team level product specialist. So it's the product owner who has content authority over the team backlog. That might come up in the exam for anybody that's studying in that regard. So far, so straightforward. I think this is pretty much how most Agile teams work, individual Agile teams work in that sort of sense. So nothing dramatically new so far. But of course, this is the scaled Agile framework. So we've got to take it up a level and increase, add a bit of scale. where you have multiple teams working together and forming an agile release train, one of the most basic elements within the Scaled Agile framework, you have a program level. And at the program level, you have business features. So these are business items. They're just as tangible, just as sort of meaningful to users or to sort of customers perhaps as business stories. But these are the things that operate at the program level. They're structured a little bit differently. They have a phrase with a business hypothesis and usually a small number of high-level acceptance criteria, which can then be managed by product managers. So one example, perhaps building on the user story we looked at earlier on, would be user account management. We have a benefit hypothesis. The reason we want to do this is a certain thing. And we have some very specific acceptance criteria, perhaps relating to maybe some non-functional requirements or some of the capabilities that this sort of a feature might need to have. And on the program backlog, these are managed by product managers. And if and when they're selected to actually be implemented, and usually in the run-up to a PI planning session, business features are broken down into stories. So you can see login is there alongside a bunch of other stories, business stories, that would exist within team backlogs. So features break down into stories. And they are of a size that is doable within a single program increment. So business features exist on the program backlog. They're planned in to program increments. That's the 8 to 12 week planning period, whereby an agile release train, a team of teams, gets together every sort of 8 to 12 weeks and plans what they're going to deliver within that sort of PI sort of period. So the scale of a feature is that it should be achievable by a single agile release train within a single program increment, i.e. it shouldn't take more than a maximum of 12 weeks to build, probably by just one team, maybe at a push by multiple teams. One business feature might be split and sort of delivered by multiple teams. The typical convention is, unless it's particularly urgent or particularly compelling, the most common scenario is that one individual business feature is implemented by a single team over a single program increment. So that would be the intended sort of way of working in that way. And product managers manage program backlogs. Program backlogs contain business features. Product managers have content authority over the program backlog, and therefore they decide which business features are brought into PI planning and are therefore implemented by the teams. Good. Lastly, we have capabilities, and these are pretty much the same as features, just a further level up. This is relatively rare. I have to say, I have to admit, as a consultant, I've never worked with a solution train before. But if you have a situation where you have multiple agile release trains building the same solution, that's a critical thing. I've often worked in scenarios where you have multiple agile release trains in an organization. But if you have 2 or 3 agile release trains, i.e. a grouping of up to 12 teams, all building the same sort of significant enterprise solution, then you go up a level in the diagram and you have a solution train. And capabilities is the term given to items in the solution backlog. They work exactly the same way as features do on the program backlog. So for example, a new global information system might exist on the solution backlog. That might then be broken down into user account management, products information, and so on and so forth, broken down into features. One of those features is the thing that we looked at in the last section, and it works other than that in exactly the same way. It's kind of sort of going up a level of scaling with a pattern following exactly the same pattern as before. And as you might expect, solution managers manage solution backlogs. Solution managers have content authority over business capabilities in the solution backlog. And these are broken down into features and given to one or more agile release trains. If I just sort of skip back to the previous version, you'll see I guess the repeating pattern there. Features break down into stories implemented by one or more teams. Capabilities break down into features implemented by one or more agile release trains. Good. So that's essentially the sort of basics of business capability or business requirements. in the Scaled Agile framework. Let's move on to the next topic then. So enabler requirements. We talked about business requirements, things that users might actually see and notice and sort of get their hands on, or even just sort of sort of things that make the product more compelling, more desirable, add value in other ways. Let's now talk about enabler requirements. And to give an example of the need for enabler requirements, imagine the scenario, a little bit like the last question, actually. Imagine that you needed to upgrade the database. So you find yourself sort of struggling with I want to save that format as a database server, or as a developer, I want to apply this this hotfix. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't help to write things in this format. Secondary to that, there is also, I think, a really important idea here to distinguish between compelling user-facing functionality, things that are going to sort of add immediate value and sort of maybe add compelling value to users straight away, contrasted with investment in technology. In any situation, whether you're doing SAFe or Prince2 or whatever you might be doing, the amount of investment you put into your underlying technology will have an impact on your ability to create more business stories in the future, or user-facing functionality in the future. So for both of those reasons, first of all, the format, and secondly, the need to invest in technology, SAFe has added to the framework the idea of enabler stories. In this case, at the story level, we have a story statement and some acceptance criteria. So in simple terms, a better way of expressing this database upgrade would be: upgrade the database to secure against a new vulnerability. Hopefully, if you're a product owner worth their salt, you'll think, yeah, that sounds pretty important to me. I can see the logic of that. I can see why that would be valuable. I don't need to navigate a clunky, as a developer or as a database server kind of format. I can just sort of get the gist of it. And of course, I think to make this work, you need to coach developers and engineers to work effectively with product owners. So it could well be the case that developers need to make the case for this, why to do this upgrade. This upgrade is going to take us 2 days of effort in total. The payoff is that we will mitigate a 0.5% risk that over the next 12 months we will be hacked, and it will be a massive reputation sort of impact. So if you can sort of phrase capabilities in business terms in ways that product owners can assess and understand, and if in addition to that there is a specific form of requirement in SAFe, the framework comes with this enabler sort of category, it gives a bit of a trigger that product owners need to be paying attention to these sorts of things. And that's really what enablers are all about. They are technical items of some sort. They represent investment in the products, and they exist at all levels in the framework. So all the different sort of forms that we looked at in the last section, from stories to features to capabilities. Enablers are a placeholder for investment, really, in the technology, in the product, in that sort of sense. So there's a few examples there at different levels. Just a few examples of typical types of enablers. It doesn't always have to be about performing a technical task. Sometimes research counts. So an exploration enabler or a spike enabler could be something which does exactly what it says on the tin and enables stories to be developed later. So let's say you had a choice. You've got a feature coming up, maybe in the next PI, you haven't yet sort of started it. You've got a choice. Do we bring in a third-party library? Do we develop it ourselves? Do we use this vendor, that vendor, or that vendor? Do we use this supplier or that supplier, or this product? So if there's some sort of technical choice which you have on the horizon, and it's not obvious which to go for, there are pros and cons of each. Perhaps you might have an enabler story in the current program increment, maybe in the current iteration, to spend 2 or 3 days doing some research or creating some prototypes or using the free trial or whatever it might be, the output of which is not a working story or a working feature, but it's an enabler to give you information. It's research. It gives you information about what to build and what option to select in the future. Architecture could be about developing out the architecture or making architectural decisions, designing the architecture for the future. There is space in the framework for architecture and design. It's not all done up front, but that doesn't mean it just evaporates and goes away entirely. There is always a need to do that. building out infrastructure, if you want to sort of spin up a few test servers or commission an entire data center, that could be an example of an infrastructure enabler. Compliance as well, that can sometimes play a role. Maybe the users don't see any effect of the fact that you're now compliant with some new regulatory change or some tweak in the regulations, but it's an enabler to allow you to continue to do business. So there's a whole range of different forms of enablers, and making space in the framework so to provide these effectively keeps you up and running. The phrase that SAFe used to describe this is that enablers build out the architectural runway. And the idea is that there is always a need for enablers. I think that the flight metaphor breaks down slightly. If you think about the fact that you're laying the runway in front of you, I guess sometimes the plane takes off, but I don't think the metaphor stretches that far. This is more of an ongoing thing. So almost as a perpetual thing, there is always a need to invest in your technology, in your sort of technical pipeline. And this approach then supports this idea of emergent design. Rather than doing all the design up front, sort of doing the complete technical architecture and system design and setting up all of the infrastructure from scratch, building a solid platform on which to build from, and only then creating front-end features. The idea is that probably if you're building a greenfield product from scratch, which as we all know is fairly rare actually, but if you are in that situation, there's a likelihood that early on, quite a lot of your capacity will be given over to enablers, and that will sort of reduce over time, and you'll get into a more of a stable state, a sort of steady state. But this sort of supports this idea of emergent design. You're evolving your architecture as you go. So enablers provide the language to describe that situation, the language describing the scenario that there is always a need for design and architecture and sort of building out infrastructure. This work is all necessary, but it's better if it's done as you go along and in an evolutionary way, rather than doing it a big bang up front in that sort of sense. You can also think of enablers as enhancing the pipeline. So there's a bit of a sort of pipeline expressed in SAFe where there is activities around continuous exploration. That's really more on the product side, so discovering requirements and doing sort of design sort of ways of thinking and sort of customer connections and things like that. But I guess the enablers really kick in when it comes to continuous integration and continuous deployment. Can we build out sort of better systems to automate sort of tests, automated sort of regression tests? Can we automate the deployment process? Can we use DevOps practices to build that out? So enablers are all about adding in and enhancing that pipeline. But let's delve into the last requirements topic, which is epics. And epics are particularly big in SAFe. In other frameworks, in other sort of general agile use, an epic can sometimes simply refer to something that will take longer than 2 weeks to build. I've known Scrum teams where an epic just takes 3 sprints and then it's done and then it's sort of signed off and then it's sort of finished. In SAFe, an epic means something very specifically different, and it means a major capital investment, something which takes significant resources, will incur significant risk or significant costs. And the format reflects the increased investment. This is the epic hypothesis statement. And in addition to that, there is an epic sort of a lean business case, which you would also produce and work on if you are sort of managing an epic or sort of trying to propose an epic. It's also true to say that the ownership model differs. So that it's not a simple scaling up, as we saw. Features, capabilities break down into features break down into stories. This is a little bit different. The model doesn't just scale up another level. You don't have epics breaking down into capabilities and further down. It's a little bit of a different thing in that sort of sense. So the idea is that you have an epic, and maybe an example might be this. This is the sort of level that we'd be sort of looking at. So here we have a scenario where an online retail business is considering an expansion into the United States market. There's a description which essentially says, we've noticed that people in the US are adding stuff to their basket, realizing it's going to take a month to get there and cost a lot of money to deliver, and then they're abandoning their baskets. On that basis, we think that it's worth establishing a presence into the US. We're therefore going to perhaps build out a site and add some infrastructure and do all the things that would be involved in creating an online retail presence in that sort of sense. There are some outcomes which are highlighted. There are some leading indicators which provide compelling information, recent increase in site visits, abandoned baskets, and so on and so forth, as well as some high-level NFRs as well. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea into the scale. You could imagine that if you were in an online retail business, an expansion into a new territory, especially with physical bricks and mortar assets, is not the sort of thing that a product owner is going to be sitting around and thinking, yeah, let's put that to the top of the backlog and let's have a go at that. So this is a major business decision, a significant change in a business model. And so the delivery of epics is managed via a portfolio backlog. They are entirely optional, I have to say. You don't have to use epics, but if you have an organization that is using the portfolio layer in SAFe, which doesn't follow the same pattern, and in fact, it doesn't require the previous layers to operate. So the portfolio layer in SAFe is largely a governance layer. It's not another sort of virtual sort of team of teams. You don't have a portfolio team per se. The portfolio layer in SAFe is more an additional layer of governance practices and budgeting practices and lean accounting and sort of things like that. So the mechanism for epics is a way of managing major capital investments in that way. They can be passed on to Agile release trains, maybe multiple arcs or even solution trains in that sort of same way. So an epic can be broken down into features or indeed capabilities, or maybe even directly into stories. But I think the difference is that an epic is more akin to a project than would be a feature in a backlog. The big difference between an epic and a traditional project is that it applies a lean budgeting approach. So lean budgeting implies putting a bit of rigor into it, so having a bit of governance and a bit of a set of criteria for the decision as to whether to invest or not. Epics require business owners, sponsors effectively from senior levels of the organization, quite often in the C-suite, would be sort of sponsoring an epic directly. And the lean budgeting cycle would be one where you would, instead of going through maybe a 3 to 6 month process to approve an epic, you would be going through more of an ongoing process and having budgets assigned to Agile release trains in such a way that you could map out that way of working in a way that avoids the sort of big startup costs and the big sort of onboarding costs, spin-up costs of major projects. And if used, the idea is that whether you have a single Agile release train or maybe you have an entire solution train, if you have the portfolio level established, sometimes you would set a particular threshold. If a feature grows to the size where it has a certain cost, a certain risk associated with it, or significant time and effort to be expanded, if it exceeds a portfolio epic threshold, it then qualifies for this extra layer of governance. It qualifies for the additional practices that involve it going through the portfolio backlog and being managed by and having oversight by lean portfolio management. There are further hoops to jump through in order to get an epic sort of approved and qualified in that way.